one gentleman. Nadeem Aslam was also supposed to be on the panel, but he couldn't be here. So I'm just the token. You know, this is really a boys' show. I'm just like, yeah, the cheese. But this is a very, very nice a collection of people. One of the things I realized when we were in the green room trying to get to know each other a little bit is that they're from 3 different continents, yeah? And I think that makes it has some impact on what we write and how we express ourselves. So that will, I hope, become apparent in the hour that we spend together. The session is called Writer's Block. So that's what we'll start with. What is writer's block? Do we have it? If we have it, what do we do with it? And then we'll sort of wander on to other stuff. This is a very, it's very informal panel. I want to think of it very much as a conversation between us. It's not a panel that has a topic. None of us are selling books. So we're just, you know, and pretty soon we'll invite you to join the conversation, whether you're a writer or a reader, or a want-to-be writer or a want-to-be reader, you know, we can all talk together. So I'm going to start with Shashi. Do you have a mic? Yes. Okay. Everybody have their own
Yes,
mic?
I do. Can you hear me back there? Yes? Okay. Thank you.
So Shashi, this morning at breakfast when we were talking, you have experienced writer's block and it has led you into strange and exciting places. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Okay. I am the world's leading expert on writer's block.
Close. Hold it close.
Oh, okay. Is that better? Okay. Thank you. I'm the world's leading expert on writer's block. I'm also slightly stupid, so it took me 3 years to figure out that there are 3 kinds of writer's block. The most frightening one, which hit me around 2004, is the kind where you have nothing to write. You have nothing to say, and it's a dreadful emptiness. Another kind of writer's block is when you're writing a book that you shouldn't be writing. I've been through that as well. And giving up a book is painful, but that's the only way to get past that kind of block. And the third kind of writer's block is the everyday block that, you know, it hits you every week when you don't get the right thing to do. You know it's in the back of your mind. It turns up by and by. It's not a big deal. My own personal, I've never tried this, but I will one of these days. I think spending some time in jail would be a good remedy for writer's block. Because...
wait, we'll get to the jail question later. Just stay with the gardening and the cooking for now.
Okay. When I got that really bad writer's block, I started learning to cook. And 3 months later, the book came fizzing out. So I think one of the ways to get past the worst form of writer's block is to do something creative with something other than words. The last time it was cooking, and the next time I get that kind of writer's block, I have my wife's instructions to start gardening instead of cooking. So I will do that.
Well, obviously, your cooking experiment has worked because your wife's willing to trust you with the garden. So I don't know whether we should say happy writer's block to you, Shashi, or may that never happen to you again.
Writer's block is, well, it's fundamentally a slightly deeper state of misery than is usual for me. And the thing is that when you get out of it, your memory of being blocked is so dire that you'll do anything not to go back there. And I'm really glad I haven't been in that place for something like 7 years now. Yes, 7 years.
Yeah, well, I hope you stay happy and writing. Alexander, you have a very interesting take on what writer's block is, but tell us first, do you experience writer's block? If you do?
I suffer from starting a book block. The first paragraph of the book causes me... Sorry? Sorry. I suffer from starting a book block. The first paragraph takes me ages. I I wrote a book called Chasing the Monsoon, which involved traveling around India for several months. And I got home to London, and I had this massive material. I had piles of notebooks, I had press cuttings, I'd read all the journals, I'd read all the recommended books, and all this stuff was sort of looking at me and saying, what are you going to do now? And my late wife called it finding the key to the door. She'd say, you found the key yet, darling? I'd say, no. But eventually, after 3 months, I got the first paragraph done. And the first paragraph is the one where you're saying to the reader, please, please, read on, even go to the end of the page. And that took 3 months. And it's a very short paragraph, but once that was in place, I was okay, and off we went. And the rest of the book just sort of fitted into place perfectly.
There's a story about Mullah Nasruddin. He was outside on the street, under the street lamp, and he was looking for something, and somebody comes up to him and says, Mullah, what have you lost? And he says, I've lost the key to the door. And he said, oh, and the guy starts looking with him, and then finally he says, Mullah, where did you lose it? He said, inside the house. He said, why are you looking for it here? He said, because there's more light. So, I mean, maybe when when the door gets locked. But I wanted also, Alexander, for you to tell everybody else what you were telling us back in the green room about the magic wand and the frontal lobe.
First of all, writer's block. It's a strange thing. There's no expression for writer's block in French or German, and I gather there's none in Hindi or Urdu. Freud wrote about writer's block, and the term was invented by an Austrian psychiatrist working in London back in the 1970s. But it's really an American phenomenon, and what the Americans have been doing with it basically is going to see their shrinks. They go to see psychiatrists. But recently, that's moving away. And the psychiatrist, incidentally, prescribed stuff like Prozac, which actually, if you have too much Prozac, diminishes any interest in writing whatsoever. But the Americans are now talking about brain chemistry. Where does writing come from? And we're talking here about the distinction between the brain and the mind. The mind, is the mind an anatomical thing? Is it a physical thing? If so, how do you explain inspiration? And they're now working on what they call a magic wand, which they pass across the frontal. The frontal lobe is apparently where we write. That's what causes us to write. They pass the magic wand across the frontal lobes, and suddenly, hey presto, full of ideas. Off you go.
Ron, do you have a magic wand for your writer's block? How do you deal with it?
I mean, I was, can you hear me? Better, closer. Okay. For me, writer's block is built into what makes writing interesting. I think if we forgot about how much we feared writer's block, still louder. Louder, okay. All right. If we forget about how terrifying writer's block seems for a minute, think about how terrifying perfect fluency seems in a writer or anybody else. Think about your feelings for, say, Tony Blair, right? Who's the most perfectly fluent human being in the world, but you realize you fear and distrust him because he seems not to think at all along with his speaking. And I think writers who have that quality of perfect glibness almost never do anything interesting. They certainly never write more than one interesting book. So in any writer's day, there are many moments in which you're out of flow, in which you don't quite know how to proceed, in which you're searching for something. You don't quite know how to find it. I think the best analog is if you look at a computer chess program, and you sometimes you get ones where you can see it trying out different positions, this position and this position, and then it'll go back 2 positions and try another set of positions. There's a kind of constant searching process and a breaking down process that's built into any process of creativity or invention, whether it's a scientist trying to figure out a molecule shape or a politician trying to figure out a solution. And I think that's part of writing as well. I think certain writers who are organized too perfectly for productivity often outrun their imaginative resources. I'm thinking, we were talking in the green room of whether it was wise to mention writers like Salman Rushdie or in my view, John Coetzee, who I think they're organized to write so effectively and fluently that they don't actually make something brilliant out of each novel. And each novel has to be individualized, and often each sentence. And I think probably my model, or the person I think of who has the most interesting view of this, is probably Tolstoy, who says, you know, people come along and they do the easy novels, right? Or you write, as a writer, you write the ones that come simply to you, the experiences that you already understand and have a view on. And then as the time goes by and you've cleared a certain amount of soil, it takes more and more time to concentrate and to push harder and deeper into something different or original. And obviously everybody's mind has a limit. So at some point you meet a limit which it may take some time to get past, or which you may never get past. And I think in that sense, writer's block is built right into creativity, and it's not something we should fear in the least.
Thank you, Imran. That's such a positive response to something that, as writers, we've been persuaded to fear, you know, and to see it as a reduction of our essential substance, which is to be a writer. But, you know, when you were talking about, or as we were talking earlier about Rushdie and Coetzee and all of that, you know, sometimes a writer's block is just a good editor. I mean, I think, you know, Rushdie could do with a writer's block or two of that kind. But I want to talk also about something which all of us have used the word in connection with the conversation on writer's block, which is fear, right? So we have the fear that we won't be able to write, or that our best writing is over, or that our best writing will never come. But what else do we fear as writers? Do you want to go first? Yeah, anybody. Yeah, you can go. We have no fears. We have a fearless panel. Brave warriors.
I have stage fright as well. I have stage fright as well. So, fear. I'm always afraid that I won't have, you know, I was blocked for 4 years. 4 years I wrote a lot and threw away 100% of what I wrote. That was terrifying, and it is never out of my mind. So I don't want to be there ever again. It's a good thing. Like Imran said, it keeps me exploring. It keeps me on my toes, and it is a very good thing because it forces me to think harder than I would otherwise.
Yeah. Alexander, do you fear your audience? Do you fear the people, your readers? Or is the greatest fear always ourselves?
I think all of us who follow this strange trade are deeply fearful underneath. It's odd because if you go back through literature to people like Dickens, they wrote in. I mean, to them, writing was trade. It was like being a carpenter or a farmer. And I mean, Trollope, for example, he wrote 49 novels in 35 years. He got up every morning at 5:30, sorry, in the dark, put his watch in front of him, and wrote until 8:30. He wrote 250 words every 15 minutes. And if he'd finished a novel before 8:30, he'd pull a piece of paper over and start the next one. And then he'd go off to his day job at the post office. So people like that wouldn't comprehend what we're talking about. Writers, what do you mean writer's block? Just get on with it, you know?
Yeah, I was wondering if we've sort of become precious 20th century people, you know, like, oh, I'm an artist. Well, I think it's important to think of ourselves as artists rather than as tradespeople. But I think also there's a fine line between fetishizing oneself and one's, you know, capacities to produce any kind of art.
Yeah, well, this whole thing of insecurity, and part of the problem, especially in the States, has been turning to alcohol. Five of the 7 writers who won the Nobel Prize for Literature were alcoholics. They included Ernest Hemingway. The people who hadn't won the Nobel Prize but still had drinking problems included people like Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams, you know. And then Scott Fitzgerald, of course, you know, famous at 23, washed out at 40, dead at 44, and he drank himself to death. He was the man who famously said, "In America, there are no second acts."
Ron, do you want to talk about fear, alcoholism?
Look, I think all of us have different strengths. I think in some ways, whoever put us here to lead or guide in the things that we see, or we think we see clearly. And as a writer, you've got to always wonder, am I seeing something clearly, or am I hallucinating, or am I seeing something so trivial that nobody should follow me, right, down the particular path I am going? And I mean, for a couple of reasons. One is that I have a readership numbered in the dozens, maybe hundreds. But also because I'm South African, I live in a country where the culture essentially is interrupted every 3 or 4 years. There are no long traditions. You can't imagine, in the way, say, Dickens or Alex could imagine that somebody in 50 years would come along and pick up your book and find it interesting. You fear almost complete pointlessness in terms of leading anybody or guiding anybody in the thing that you understand. I mean, I'm not talking about being a guru or demagogue. I'm just saying that there's something inherent to writing certain kinds of books which requires, I wouldn't say followers, but people who see that the path that you've identified is an interesting path. And obviously there are many different avenues of writing novels, writing poems, creative inspiration that lead to dead ends. And I think above all, the fear of leading myself or leading other people or leading nobody into a dead end is terrifying.
Yeah, I fear that what I have to say is not important enough, you know, or that it's important only to me. Nobody cares. And quite often that's true. I mean, but somehow you just do it also because you are doing it. You want to. You don't know how to do anything else, or there's nothing else that you prefer to do than this. I mean, nothing gives me greater pleasure than translating. I enjoy that even more than writing because there's something, you know, you surrender to a different universe, you step outside. Of course, you're always writing in a physical space, but when you are writing, you're not in that physical space at all. You're somewhere else, like jail.
No, I think that idea of surrender is very important to me. I wonder how someone like Barack Obama survives when every day everybody smiles at him and says wonderful things to him. And you know, I mean, in a minor way, you see that with many writers, right? Almost everything they encounter is affirmation and praise. And I think it's almost impossible for the human soul, and certainly the imagination, to survive that without a very strong ideal of sacrifice and service to something, right? And being a translator is one way of serving.
You know,
Please.
behind all the fear and stuff is also the conviction that you have something worthwhile to say, and if you work at it long enough, you will find it. And if you find it, you will, for a moment, be happy. That little moment of happiness, that is a high that I can tell you from experience, you will not get even from heroin.
There's also that incredible moment when you know your book is done, you know, and it's like relief, it's like sadness, it's like loneliness, you know, and the next week when you wake up every day, what am I going to do, man? My book is done, you know, and that sense of lonely, you're just really lonely without this thing that, you know, you've been working on for however many months.
Yeah, you know, I haven't had that for the past few years because every time I finished a book, I've always had an idea for the next, waiting. As a matter of fact, by the time I finished my last book, I had 2 ideas, and I'm now working on both of them.
You better give me one because I have no ideas for my next book. The other very peculiar fact that came out in our private conversation before we came here is that all of these 3 gentlemen have been in jail Yeah, so I'm the only non-criminal on this panel. Please remember that. Yeah.
We can arrange something, I'm sure.
Well, you know, actually, Alexander, in this country now it's really easy to be a criminal, but you get to be a political criminal, which is how glamorous, you know, not a petty thief, but you know, a free thinker. So I imagine that you have all been in jail for different reasons, or are you all united by some secret jail-going society which doesn't have me as a member? So Alexander, you were in jail in Timor.
I was in jail in East Timor, locked up by the Indonesians because I was traveling by aeroplane down to Australia, recreating the old Imperial Airways route, which went from London to Brisbane. And it took 2 weeks, and they stopped at something like 40 different places. So I was going down there, and East Timor was one of the stops. And I talked my way onto an Indonesian military plane, which was going to Timor, and they let me on. But when I got to Timor, I was handcuffed and locked, basically because I had no right to be there. No visa, no permission, nothing. And so this was bad news. And they put me away for just over 24 hours. And then instead of letting me out, took me back to the airport and put me on a plane to Australia. So I got to Australia anyway.
Rather quickly,
Yes.
and cheaply, I think.
And cheaply, yes, yeah.
And you've done 19 hours in jail, so now we're counting jail time. Yeah.
I've been, I think I'm the only person here who's been in jail in 2 countries. I've been in jail in India, and I've been in jail in the Middle East. I've also visited a jail in India to see what death row looks like. So that's 3 visits to jails. The most interesting was being in jail in the Middle East. You know,
Why were you in jail, Shashi?
yeah. It was the day after I got there, and I didn't know that there was a dress code for being out on the street. So I went out on the street in my dhoti and discovered the hard way that it's not allowed, that Indians are not allowed on the streets in dhotis. Americans are. That's a different matter. They can wear what they like, but Indians aren't allowed on the street in dhotis, so I was taken away to a police station. I used to work for an American concern at the time. They let me make a phone call, and other phone calls happened, and they let me out. The strange thing is that they just let me out. They just said, okay, now you can go home. And I asked one of them, look, if I go out wearing this dhoti, aren't you going to be, isn't someone going to arrest me and bring me right back here? And it struck them that yes, that was true. So, so they took me back home. They dropped me off home. The Indian jail was, I would prefer not to talk about it because I'm going to write about it one of these days. So we'll skip that. We'll skip my arrest, but the other visit, the visit to the jail where I wanted to see death row, that was tremendous because I actually got a policeman to show me the cells where, to show me death row. And it's a row of 6 rooms, 6 cells. And there was actually a person living in there at that time. And there was this, it's a gate, it's a gate painted with primer. And there's a little hole in it. There's an eye hole in it through which the warders watch the guys living in there. So when I was there, the warder took a look through it and said, yeah, here, you can see that guy. If you come quickly, you'll see that guy. I went and had a look, and there was this perfectly ordinary looking person, short, skinny guy with a mustache, wearing white clothes, looking right back at me as if he didn't have a care in the world. And seriously, at the time, he didn't seem bothered by the fact that he was on death row, that he didn't have very long to live. He was executed, I think, 3 years after I saw him. And he didn't seem to be bothered at all about where he was. And I came away from that with a feeling of, I was kind of, what can I say? I was stunned at I was stunned at the equanimity with which this person could look at his own forthcoming death. I have not been able to forgive that yet.
Can I just say, I've just remembered a detail about my prison cell in Timor. Through the barred windows outside, there was a pit with a very large Komodo dragon in it. It was the family pet of the commanding officer. And every hour, somebody would walk out and throw a live chicken at this beast. So there was no telly, but that was good entertainment, I can tell you.
Except probably for the chicken.
Yes.
I mean, one quick thing about your question about fear. The thing I think every writer or speaker fears is to be boring. And nowadays, it's very easy to tell because you can just see how many people are checking their Facebook accounts. I'm very impressed with you as an audience for refraining from, or maybe the internet is just not available in this room, but that's wonderful. My jail experience is probably, I spent even fewer hours as an actual prisoner than these guys. In 1989, the laws in South Africa on beaches were that you could be Indian or black, African, and you could be on the sand, but you couldn't be in the water, right? So I went to a protest and accidentally stepped in the water and was hauled off to jail for being in the water. But I've been reading a lot about kind of, and trying to think about the two great jail experiences of jail writers of the 20th century. And I think they are, writers is maybe the wrong word, but Gandhi and Mandela in jail. They really made something of being in jail, you know, being on an island, being confined. And I think they're very inspirational in terms of what you make of being in a confined space over time. And obviously, there's a long analogy between being a writer at his desk, trying to find the universe in a nutshell, like Hamlet, and being in jail, which is partly frivolous, but there's something underlying those.
In South African jails, they hang you, don't they?
Not my one.
Not your one.
They abolished capital punishment in 1990, and for writers, somewhat later.
Yeah. But would you like to invest a few years in jail just to learn how to write better? I wouldn't. I wouldn't. A day or two, yes. A year or two, no.
Our jail system has really gone downhill in terms of the caliber of people in it, in my opinion. But also, you know, when you're a parent, you know, the idea of being sent off to a conference or to jail for 3 weeks just so you can get a piece of writing out of the way is very appealing.
Which actually, the conversation that's going on about do you need to be in jail to be a good writer, which is not what we're really talking about, but we are talking about there's something, and which I've actually noticed in a couple of people I know that have been incarcerated for much longer periods, for months and years. There's something, they become very spare, you know, not only in their person, but all the rubbish sort of goes away, and there's a clarity to how they see themselves in the world, and the world, it's quite astounding because, you know, somebody goes in sort of a scruffy, whatever, political prisoner and comes out almost saintly. And I've been very struck by that, and I'm wondering if, it's a related question, that how much do we need solitude as writers, and how do we balance the need to be alone and write with the sort of worldly commitments that each of us has as a spouse or a parent or a teacher or, you know, any of those things. So, Alexander, particularly when you write something as magnificent as Chasing the Monsoon, you've been on the road for months and months and months, yeah? Your circumstances are changing all the time. You're making notes. How do you write when you're on the road, and how do you write when you're at home?
You get preoccupied with, taking notes, obviously, but things like laundry. If you're moving around the country, you obviously you travel light, so I had a small bag, and I had so many pairs of underwear, so many socks, so many shirts. And so you measure your trip by, okay, so I'm going on to there, and I'll stay for 24 hours, and I'll get my shirts done. and that's the way you measure the trip. Because you're just getting on with life, really. And then, but if you're lucky, and I was lucky with the monsoon, the journey takes on a momentum of its own, and it sort of sucks you up and brings you in. And that was lovely. And when I finished the thing, I felt, getting home from India, I felt a real sense of loss. I missed India, and I missed doing what I was doing, back in boring London, you know, with my notebooks.
You know, some years ago, I took a motorbike ride around the country. And I had the same kind of experience that he had. But let me say one thing first. My wife writes. So when I need solitude, when I need to lock myself up, I can do it without having to worry about consequences. Yeah, this motorbike ride. It was much like he said, you know, where do I do my laundry, and how do I catch up with my, you know, this was in the days before cell phones and so on. Not before cell phones. I didn't have a cell phone. I refused to carry one. And I spent practically all the time I wasn't actually in the saddle writing notes. Every day I'd spread those notes out, read through them again, and at the end of it I wrote a book which was unfortunately unpublishable. And only now, 10 years after I did that, has it begun to fall into place. And I hope I'll be able to get a book out of it over the next, maybe over the next 3 or 4 years.
But Imran, you not only write yourself, but you help other people become better writers. You teach creative writing. Don't you want to keep your best ideas for yourself instead of just telling some kid, hey, you know, that guy really should fall into the well at this point?
Actually, sometimes it's just about rooms. I have an office at our university, and I think about 11 novels have been written in that office, none by me, but by my students. I tend to work at home, but I remember I was on a panel once with Kiran Desai, who talked about what it was like to grow up in a house with a mother who is a writer. It's a very distinctive experience. But even to say that makes me realize all of us grow up in distinctive houses. You know, for example, if your mother is a grocer, or if your father is a fisherman or something. You know, every house has its own character, and it's one of those things you observe and inherit as a writer or any other kind of observer, and it shapes how you see things. Shakespeare's dad was a glover, right? I've never understood what a glover is, but it seems that he makes gloves, I suppose, or dyer or something. And you see those images of dyeing and glove making in his work. So yes, you know, some people can actually go to offices and do work, but for me, part of the joy of being a writer is actually having a house. Now, that places you in a power struggle with children and nannies and other people who also believe that it's their house. And for a while you can win that fight just by being patriarchal, but eventually they overrun you and take over the house. So then you have to get very good at writing while there's noise and chaos around you. And that's just a different kind of writing.
Yeah, we're very lucky in the sense that we can work at home. You know, I was able to, when my kids were growing up, I was able to be with them and be a good father. And that was entirely due to the trade I was following, you know.
Yeah, I think all of us as writers have also, I mean, however tortured we are, and as Shashi says, there are so many moments of unhappiness and fear and, you know, a lot of negative emotions, but basically, we just think we're damn lucky that we can do this, you know, at the pace that we want to, and, you know, we can write about the things that we want to write. Alexander,
and we get paid for doing it.
And we get paid for doing it, yeah. So, but so that, you know, I mean, there are so many wonderful things about a writer's life. And I was very taken around by what you said, that we also learn to work in noise and chaos and, you know, children and pots and pans and all of that. What is, you know, the bad things about a writer's life are, you know, our emotions and our anxieties. But physically, what are the things that we absolutely cannot write within? I mean, what would stop you? What would make it impossible for you to write even 300 words a day, which is a lot, actually?
Noise. Noise. I have sensitive ears. I can't write if there's a lot of noise. But something like housework. We don't have help. We have a fairly large house, which we look after ourselves. I don't mind doing housework because it's good work to do. It frees up your mind to think. It's a very good thing to do. But noise I can't abide.
For me, it's actually songs. I can listen to music, but I can't listen to songs that I know when I'm writing, because then I start singing them, or half my mind is following the words, but music is fine, but songs just like, ugh, it really sets me off. Alexander, what is the one thing that you...
Bad hangover. A bad hangover is the usual cause. But I'm also quite interested in why people, the reasons for writer's block. I mean, we've been talking about this, but I was thinking about a recent poet laureate who's got writer's block because he felt the Queen didn't appreciate his work. In other words, she didn't like his stuff. And so and there's another, put my glasses on, there's another extraordinary case concerning a man called Joseph Mitchell, who was a writer at the New Yorker magazine. And he was one of their star writers. And I got to read this out, actually. And he wrote a wonderful article in 1962, which received high praise. Praise is what brought him down. A professor, I'll read this out. A professor called him the greatest living master of the English declarative sentence. And it stopped him dead. For the next 32 years, this man went to the office every day and he never published another word. So if people praise you, be careful.
And what is the one thing that you don't want when you're working?
No, I was thinking on completely different track. I don't know if anybody knows actually not all of his articles are good, but I'm thinking of the New Yorker writer who always has snappy ideas. Do you remember his name? Anyway, everybody secretly knows his name. But he distinguishes between two ways of failing, between choking and panicking, right? Choking is when there are too many options. So you run up to the high jump and you think, should I go there, should I go there, and you fall flat on your face because you can't choose between the options. Panicking is when you're underwater and you lose your scuba thingamajiggle and you panic, you can't think of any options, right? So those are two possibilities for writers. The other thing is the writers who are more likely to get into trouble. Now, all distinctions are shady distinctions, but the fox and hedgehog distinction is always useful, right? From Isaiah Berlin, the fox is someone who's interested in thousands of different things, in anthropology in Mali and in the stock market and in fashion and in whatever. And many writers, especially at literary festivals, are natural foxes. Right? The hedgehog is the person who's interested in one thing, and he just follows it, or she follows it all his life like a hedgehog, right? And I think you're much more likely to get into serious writer's block as a hedgehog than a fox. And you think about who are the famous hedgehogs? Probably Ralph Ellison in our century, very famous hedgehog. I think James Joyce, in a way, had a very serious case of writer's block because he just produced unintelligible work for decades. I think Coetzee falls into the same category. So I think if you're a fox and you can connect 500 different things, then you finish your novel and you think, well, I've always wanted to write that novel about enchantresses in Armenia in the 14th century, right? Now I have the 6 months I can do that in. And then when you finish that, you're about to write the fantasy novel with dwarves or whatever it is. So I think it also depends very much on your temperament and your sense of how serious and consistent your projects are.
You're such a man of binaries. I just realized that now because...
Well, yes and no.
In the green room, you gave us another set of binaries about think fast and think slow or something. So do you want to tell everybody else about that as well?
No, it's just there's a book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, that everybody was reading for a while, except us. But their view was just there are two natural ways of responding to a situation. the habitual automatic way, what they call system one. So somebody asks you a question you already know the answer to. You know, what's your name? What's 3 and 3? You know, who should be running the country? You know, those are kind of automatic responses. And system two is when you realize your knowledge doesn't actually cover the situation, and you have to think about it and come up in a reflective way with an answer. Now, writing is a surprising mix of system one and system two, in the same way that speaking is a mix of system one and system two, right? Often, I mean, I don't even say this in a bad way about myself, but I often speak without thinking at all. And I don't even necessarily say stupid things. It's just that thinking is often not called for when you speak. Sometimes that's system one speaking. Sometimes system two speaking is when someone actually asks you a question you have no idea how to answer, but you think is interesting. And then you spend some time looking at the data, thinking about it for yourself, trying to assemble a response. And I think you can hear when you're at a festival, you hear writers who are thinking, and you hear ones who are refusing to switch into system two. And I think, in a sense, writer's block is the most profound version of system two, redirection into self-reflective, self-destroying or criticizing thinking.
Writer's block, one of my favorite definitions of writer's block is when your imaginary friends stop talking to you. And as a corollary to that, I met a Welsh novelist whose characters spoke too loudly to him. It was a post-war novel. It was about an Italian prisoner of war working on a Welsh farm, and he fell in love with the farmer's daughter. And it was a love story, and it was going to end happily. But the characters said, no, we're not going quietly. The Italian went back to Italy, and the farmer's daughter married an estate agent. And that's how the book ended, because the characters wouldn't let him. Now, I've never written a novel, but can you believe that?
Yeah, Shashi, does that happen to you? Do your characters say, no, you're not
They take you over, they decide what, yeah.
Yeah, it happens. Because I'll tell you when it happens. When I typically say a quarter or a third of the way through a book, the story takes momentum of its own. And the characters begin to, form themselves rather than me doing anything to them. At least that's what it feels like. And at some stage, one of the characters gets writer's block. That's when I get blocked.
Yeah. I was thinking also, Alexander, from what you were saying, when the voices in your head stop talking to you, when your imaginary friend is not playing with you anymore. And I know that what happens when I'm working, and I don't write fiction, I write sort of around and around this other story. And there are nights when you can't sleep because it's still going on. And then of course I'm too lazy to get out of bed, right? So I keep paper and pencil next to me and make what I think are notes. And in the morning, it looks like chicken scrawl, I can't read my handwriting. And the other thing is sometimes I'm like, really? I thought this was deep. So that process, but I want that imaginary friend to keep talking. I don't want, that's another reason how I know that the book is finished when that guy is not,
Graham Greene kept a dream journal, and when he had writer's block, he would go back to that, and something from one of his dreams would trigger an idea, and which I think is quite an interesting thought, actually. But again, if I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a thought, I just go back to sleep again,
You are a wise man, Alexander. I sort of take my thoughts sometimes to the other room and write it by my computer, and it's just like, it's almost never worth all that trouble. So, we have about 15 minutes left. So if you'd like to join the conversation, if you have burning questions on some things that we've said, some things that we haven't said, please, is there somebody with a microphone? The young lady in the, red t-shirt.
Hi, hello, my name is Malvika. You talked about, in the beginning of your speech, you talked about that feeling when you have to give up your ideas of books. What I fail to understand is when do you identify that this certain writer's block is something that you need to give up on your idea, give up on your book now, or you just feel that it is not going to finish, or you have to keep on or not give up? How do you figure that line out? Because it's sometimes really difficult to give up on an idea which you felt was so dear to you and you thought it might lead somewhere.
Yeah. It's like this. It's happened to me. It's happened to me twice. I've actually finished one book, and I knew halfway through, not halfway through, I knew when I was about 5,000 words into it that I wasn't putting my heart into it. There was something false. You know, okay, let me put it this way. The crucial thing about a book is finding your voice. It's not the active voice, passive voice sort of thing, but your narrative voice. Once you found it, that's the trouble that he has with his first paragraph. So once you find your voice, you know when you follow it, whether it's genuine or not. At some stage, you get impatient and you are dishonest with that voice. Okay, if you continue with that dishonest voice, well, you shouldn't be doing it. It's not something that you figure out. It is something that you know. It comes from being honest. It comes from. It's not something that you reason out. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Actually, it has happened to me a lot of time because, like, you come up with an idea that you want to work upon, but you don't feel connected to it.
Yeah.
But then the people you've shared your idea with, they tell you, oh no, it's good, you should start doing it. And they just sort of start saying that you're giving up on your idea, you're a quitter.
No, you
Don't
remember,
listen to other
you
people.
remember what he said? Praise is a killer. Alex said that just a few minutes back. So watch out for praise.
I don't follow any sort of particular pattern. It just happens. I mean, most of my life I'm in a sort of state of mental turmoil, and just occasionally something comes out, and hey presto, I'm lucky. Good question.
Thank you.
I would say I think the best insight I know into intellectual work is the same as mechanical work. Break it into such small parts that you can actually get a fair amount done in a week. And so I think the best way to start writing is probably to write short stories or essays or something, so that you're not committing yourself to a year or two of doing a project you don't quite believe in. And look, sometimes there was a Hollywood horror movie about 10 years ago called something about it was called Final Destination. And the idea was these people had cheated death by not dying somewhere, and so death was going to come and get them anyway, right? So sometimes death is following your novel, and it's going to kill your novel somehow. The world just doesn't want that novel to exist. That does happen, right? But it doesn't always happen, and it's worth trying to escape. But I think once you've written a couple stories, you have something written, then you can be in a position where a novel has to die, right? But even then, something of that novel will live. You'll find a character will somehow miraculously be resurrected in another novel, or a scene will be useful. So almost nothing really goes to waste, finally. But there are definitely, there are completely misconceived projects in the world. I once tried to write a novel about a guy who would only go out. He would only have as his girlfriend the daughters of Nobel laureates. And I really enjoyed writing it because it made my friends so angry as I was writing it. But it was clearly a novel that needed to die, you know? And I think we probably all have those experiences.
Yeah, I agree. I think nothing ever really goes away. It doesn't work for a little while, or it doesn't work in this place, or it doesn't work at this time. But it's like the dream journal, you know, and it's not even like you have to keep the piece of paper. It's somewhere inside you. And, you know, if it deserves to be born, it shall be. It's very sort of Darwinian, you know, universe. Would you like to respond, Alexander? Shall I ask for the next question?
I was just going to say, what was I going to say? Oh, how do I, yeah, okay. I completely lost my thread. Sorry about that, folks.
It'll come back.
It'll come come
Yeah.
back. If so, I'll interrupt. And, yeah.
Dilip, of course.
I've always wondered why writers wish to have this term writer's block. I mean, every profession gets their own blocks. I mean, I've been in software like Shashi's been in software, and there were times when you couldn't write the next bit of code, and I'm sure that happens to film directors or, auto mechanics, I don't know. So can you guys give me a little hint about why do writers have this privilege? That's the only word I can think of.
I can tell you straight away. Writers can whinge much more effectively than other people. It's as simple as that.
Writers can what?
Whinge.
And
You
also,
know, we complain about it, we talk about it. You don't. If you're a software developer and
And
you're
al-
stuck for a bit of code, maybe your boss yells at you, but that's it.
There's no such term as software block. Go ahead.
but
You should demand one, and you talk about it, you make it.
we also live by our wits, and garage mechanics don't do that. And so we're dependent. Incidentally, I just recalled what I was going to say before. I'm going to be 80 a month from today, and I'm now working on my first novel, and it's about a group of women in their 70s, and I've been going on this for about 3 or 4 years now, and the characters have completely taken me over. They're live. I talk to them, they talk to me, they wake me up, and they have their own ideas about things. So whether the wretched thing's ever published or not doesn't really matter. I'm just having a fantastic time writing it.
Are they daughters of Nobel laureates?
No.
I just wanted to respond also to Dilip's question, like why again, it's the question of preciousness, preciosity, like why do we have writer's block and why do, I think, and I do think writers are artists, and I think an artist is required to be self-reflexive. You have to be aware of your process. You may not do it every day, you may not, articulate it necessarily, but somewhere that consciousness is very important. And I think it's great that, we designate our difficulty with a name rather than have some amorphous thing, I'm going to ask for one more question?
Yeah, go for
okay, very good.
Can I just say, it's also dependent on your bank manager. You have to confront him from time to time. So we're also earning a living.
Absolutely true. Sorry, the lady in front.
Okay, I have a different problem. I've been writing commercially, if I may say so, for the advertising industry, public relations, and all of that. I was fortunate to write a book, but that was again commissioned. So it was again a commercial kind of a book. I'm writing my second commission book. I really want to write imaginary writing, and somehow I can't get down to it. I'm just used to that commercial thing that, okay, this is the deadline, do it now, and so I can't do it. Any ideas?
I talk to your friends. Just sort of get a group of you together and talk about your ideas, and just let the whole thing be discussed. Ideas will occur to them, they'll occur to you. So go a bit public with your mates. That's what I do.
This is another very important thing, and it's, I get really sort of a little discombobulated when I haven't written for a while. And so I'm just like, something is missing, it's like I didn't shower or something. I'm very aware that I've missed one stage in my day. So I write every single day, even if it is a long and complicated email, but the physical act of writing, the physical act of working through ideas, and it just automatically makes me feel better. Like, because of literature festivals and all that, you don't write for 2 days, then you start acting really weird, some of us do. Anyway. One more question? Yes, please.
My name is Rashida, and basically you guys just talk about the imagination. That imagination, people talks to you, and this happen with me all the time, because even right now someone is sitting behind me and he nudged me, "Kat, see, they are talking about me right now." But when I write about them, I can't write anything. Means that is this person who talks to me, who tell me that my life is going on like my life is going like this. I am doing this. I have talked to them, and they reacted like that, and everything what he is doing in his life, which is not real. I know that. But when I try to write about him, I can't write anything. But when he gives me ideas, he write about this thing, he shows me. But I want to write about him also. But every time he stops me from doing that. Why is that? Why can't I write about that particular person which, he's close to me, she's close to me, that a certain universe completely surround me. I know everything, I know every details. But when I, start to write I can't even imagine a single word or what you say. I don't know how to
Imran,
describe it.
you're the creative writing teacher. You have to answer that question.
Please, seriously, I need a help about this because this is going on with
Okay.
me about from past 7 years. I'm thinking about it and every time I, explore more. It's
Okay,
not that I'm
Rashida,
going back.
we got the point, yeah? I'm going to let Imran answer the question. Thank you.
I mean, two things from my experience. One is I live on the side of a mountain, Table Mountain, and it's very hard to go up Table Mountain directly, right? So if you set off at it directly, it's very hard. So only very serious mountaineers go up it. But if you go up one of the kind of winding paths, you tend to get there. And the second piece of experience I draw from my wife, who understands that there are things I disagree with, but as long as you take a slightly different tack from like the straightforward, you often get exactly where you need to go. So if you're thinking, I really need to conquer this subject, I need to get this person down on paper, it's going to worry you and upset you and you're not going to quite get it. So think about a sideways way of doing it, right? Is there some gesture the person has? Is there some particular scene? Most novels are essentially composed of scene, connective tissue, summary, scene. And it's a real art to think of what's an interesting scene? What kind of mood is the scene in, right? And people are much more, it's very rarely that somebody comes up to us and presents themselves to us in purity and clarity, right? We more often see them in motion, right? Doing something, right? Making a salad, starting a fire, right? Arguing with us when they're clearly wrong, right? So put the person in motion, have them in a scene, and always go about things indirectly, especially in imaginative ways, because the straightforward ways are often, they're going to be too clumsy and awkward for you, and I think that's probably why you're resisting. I've often had journalists who I find to be some of the best writers because they understand the basic thing, which is you sit down and write, right? That's the thing. And many people who don't write don't understand that that's really the basis. You sit down with an open blank rectangle in front of you and do stuff, but they also have too much speed, right? And sometimes speed is a problem, so they have to learn to break that speediness. And I think the easiest way is to say, I'm going to be here for 3 hours. I really don't need to write 1,000 words, right? I can write 100 words. If I write 100 words every day for a year, I'll have some large fraction of a novel. So it's a lesson Gandhi always cared about, which is slow down, right? For the sake of art, you need to slow down to the right pace. So slowing down, expecting less of yourself each time, choosing an indirect way into a subject or life. I mean, for me, these are recipes. They're useful. They may not work, but or choose something else to write about. Or the advice, Wittgenstein would always tell his philosophy students, the one thing you do, don't be a philosophy professor. And he would be very proud of his students who went off to work on the railways or found some other gainful employment. So, I mean, my final piece of advice is if you have any choice, don't be a writer, be something productive. I don't know if...
No, just, we're going to wrap. So I wanted to thank all three of you for being so forthright and so charming and so also vulnerable and, sharing it with a bunch of strangers. But I have one piece of advice that I learned very recently, and I think certainly Alexander, it will resonate about writing is, I carry it around now in my makeup box. It's a little button that says write drunk, but edit sober. So on that piece of, on the tutelary note, thank you very much for being here, and thank you all for being just so lovely.